The Czech Republic is very well known for its tasty food, great beer, and also gorgeous places you can visit. But it is also home to many inventions. And one of these inventions will be playing a key part in today's story, as it altered the history of a small town in Jeseník region, which part of my family is from. I still remember the day when the events took place. And for years and years, people would be terrified to go to that very building, where in just mere seconds, it got turned into a scene from hell. But before we get started, my name is Andrea Scott, and in my online series, I'll be telling you about some of the most bizarre and unbelievable stories that I have come across. So if this is something that might interest you, then please do stick around, as I'll be uploading weekly. But now, go brew yourself a strong pot of coffee and let's get started with our episode 2. It was the year 1799, and in a small village now called Jeseník in the Czech Republic, a baby boy was born into the Prisnitz family. He was the youngest of the 5 and was baptized as Vincent Franz, and his parents were actually quite well known to the area because they were the descendants of the very first settlers. When Vincent was just 6 years old, his family experienced a series of tragic events. His oldest brother, that was eventually going to take over the farm, sadly passed away from brain fever. And this was said to sadden the father so much that he grew very weak and he wasn't really able to work at the farm anymore and eventually lost his sight. This meant that young Vincent had to step in and start helping out way more. And this really wouldn't be unheard of because at the time, many families would rely on their children to help around. And while he was still enrolled in school, his attendance started to rapidly decrease because he had so much to do. But that didn't stop Vincent in pursuing his interest. And even though he was very behind on writing skills, he was proficient in reading, math, and he was also very observant. Slowly, he was also beginning to build a reputation as a healer. Vincent spent a lot of his time outside and, for example, was able to then observe how the changing temperature affected his own body as well as the animals and plants around him. And so he was always experimenting with natural ways to treat wounds and sicknesses. And whenever Vincent could, he would grow his understanding and knowledge of how effective his treatments were. One day, when Vincent was working in a nearby forest felling timber, his axe slipped and he managed to injure one of his fingers and also sprain his wrist. But he remained calm and remembered that recently he saw a deer nurse his wounds in a nearby stream. And so Vincent picked himself up and he walked over to the nearby water pump, and there he submerged his wounds underneath the cold water. This brought Vincent instant relief. But as effective as it was, he also realized he wasn't really going to be able to keep the hand underneath the water for longer periods of time. And so he had a eureka moment. He tore a few pieces of his shirt, he wetted those rags, and then he rubbed those rags around his wounds. This meant that the wound would have a steady supply of water application, and that would also prevent from further swelling and inflammation. A couple of years later, Vincent, who was now 17, suffered yet another injury, but this time it was much more serious than his previous scratches and sprains. As Vincent was driving a large van filled with oats, his horse pulling the cart suddenly got spooked. Vincent tried calming down the horse so that it wouldn't run away, but as he was doing this, the horse kicked the cart and sent Vincent flying out of it. And then, because he was still attached to the cart, the horse galloped over Vincent's body, who was now lying on the ground, totally passed out. The scene was then attended by a local surgeon, who, after examining Vincent, delivered crushing news to the family. Vincent, who had now several broken limbs and ribs, was now in life-endangering condition. And if he did manage to pull through, he would very likely remain invalid and unable to do any sort of physical work. When Vincent woke up and learned of his fate, he was devastated, because it only really brought back all the memories from before when his brother had died and his father went blind. But he refused to give up. He started experimenting with all sorts of herbs to create concoctions that he would then drink, but they were not really working and they weren't relieving any of his pain. And so he decided to change the course of his treatment. He would apply something that he heard of working before. Now, this method required Vincent to start dressing his torso in wet rags, and he pulled them on so tightly that he was barely able to move around in them. And to treat his pain, he began drinking the cold water that was brought to him from the nearby stream. And miraculously, his efforts began to work, and soon enough he was able to stand up, and he even returned to his farm to continue with his work. His recovery greatly inspired him to treat others as well, and soon enough flocks of people were pouring in to come in to see him, and even by 1822, Vincent decided to expand his old father's house so that he could turn a portion of it into a sanatorium. And with these growing resources and also his fame, he eventually in 1838 was given the permission to turn his house into a spa. And over time it began to flourish and also grow so that he could even treat more patients. All of a sudden, Vincent was being sent for from all over Europe so that he would treat the emperors and their family members, and he was even soon recognized overseas. You can find several of his statues around the region, and even there was a life-size portrait of him that was eventually hung in the main entrance room of the spa. Ultimately, Vincent Prisnitz would often be named as the father of hydrotherapy. Even after his death in 1851, the spa, as well as its practices, continued to grow. A strong benefiting factor is undoubtedly its location. After you climb a steep hill, you're rewarded with gorgeous views of the mountains and of the region, and also there are a lot of activities you can do. For example, you can take a hike around the sanatorium, which would then show you a lot of trees and statues, and it even is a home to Vincent's mausoleum. There are also several points where you can bottle up that spring water, and that is a very popular thing to do around there, and lots of locals swear by its health effects. Even when I was younger, my mom and grandma gave me some of that water whenever I was feeling unwell. And I can still remember those endless nights when I was wrapped in those wet rags to, try and lower my temperature. And even though it wasn't really the most of comfortable things to do, it really did work. And while all of this might sound like a bit of a paradise on earth, it also contains a very dark and traumatizing piece of history. While a lot of patients do stay over at the sanatorium when they're being treated, it is not unheard of people that only come in for the day of their appointment and they leave as soon as they're done. This is particularly possible if you only have that one consultation and you don't have to undergo any other procedures, that require you to stay for several days for it to take its full effect. And so many patients just come in on the day of their appointment, they check in at the reception, and then they are sent off to wherever they need to go. And this was also true for a 63-year-old, tall and robust man, Bohumil Scholle. In fact, Bohumil was very well known to everybody at the sanatorium because he had been coming in for the past 20 years. He suffered from extreme depression after he sustained injuries in an explosion. And so the local staff were trying to lessen his pain in a variety of treatments. Now, explosions is something you generally don't come by very often. But for Bohumil, that was sort of a bread and butter of his daily routine. For many years, he was working for a company called Synthesia, and that was in the late 1950s the birthplace of a plastic explosive called SEMTEX. SEMTEX, unlike other plastic explosives, became particularly popular for its many benefits, and that included it being waterproof, it was usable over higher temperatures, and also it was much more difficult to detect it. Its main use was in demolition and commercial blastings, but over time, due to its advantages, it also became widely used by some terroristic organizations. Odorless and red in color, the substance was being smuggled out of the country in large quantities and was being used by, for example, the IRA and the Middle East. During Vietnam War, North Vietnam used 14 tons of SEMTEX, but without any doubt, its largest consumer became Libya, where a staggering 1,000 tons of SEMTEX were shipped to by Omnipol between the years 1975 and 81. And while the explosive, just like other explosives, was made in good faith, its misuse was not addressed until 1988. There, 200 grams, which is about 7 ounces, was brought on board the plane Pan Am Boeing 747, which was traveling from Frankfurt to Detroit. The plane, carrying 259 passengers and crew, was brought down over Scotland in Lockerbie. There were no survivors, and the crash killed further 11 people on the ground. Shortly after this terroristic incident, the former president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, issued a statement where, while the country would not stop producing SEMTEX, Synthesia would work on ways to make the explosive detectable. And so all batches after 1990 would have their lifespan shortened to about 5 years, and the product would now also come with a strong vapor. All batches prior to 1990, however, would remain untagged. And so it was just really the matter of time before it would be misused. And so just before 2 p.m. on the day of the 25th of May 1997, Bohumil, the former employee of Synthesia, got off his train that arrived from Prague in the nearby Jeseník. He would have been on his journey for about 4 hours by that point, and so as soon as he got off, he wasted no time and aimed for the bus stop. There, he only had to wait several minutes before he was picked up by a bus he had taken so many times before, and that was now starting to drive him up the steep hill to the spa house. It was a very warm, sunny day, and Bohumil knew that as soon as he gets off the bus, he still has to go a few hundred meters before he reaches the spa. And so when the bus comes to a halt, he picks up his hat, puts it on his head, and he also picks up his leather briefcase that he had with him. He gets off the bus and he starts walking up the hill to reach the spa. And when he finally does, he goes through the rotating main door and says hello to the receptionist who he had seen before. The receptionist also recognizes Bohumil, and so she picks up the reservations book and starts looking for where he needs to go that day so she can tell him. In the meantime, Bohumil, who is still a little bit panting and is a bit sweaty from the climb he had just made, he crosses the entry hall and sits down on a chair that is positioned in front of the very famous life-size portrait of Vincent Prisnitz. As Bohumil begins to steady his breath, he takes off his hat, puts it onto the chair next to him, and he picks up his leather briefcase and puts it across his legs. There he opens it and looks at what's inside. Back at the front desk, the receptionist, who is still scanning through the appointments book, is beginning to be visibly annoyed because she cannot find the appointment for Bohumil. And so she closes the book, she puts it underneath her arm, and she aims for the door that is located just behind the front desk, because there's a staff room, and so she thinks that she can go in and ask one of her colleagues if maybe one of them forgot to put the appointment down, and so they know where Bohumil should go. And as she reaches the door and opens it, she hears an extremely loud explosion, and she's thrown through the door by a massive shockwave. It would turn out the reason Bohumil came from Prague to the spa was to not visit his psychiatrist. He came to commit a suicide by expertly and precisely crafted a bomb. And as soon as Bohumil connected those wires, his body was torn in pieces that obviously killed him instantly. The years of working at Synthesia made him an expert at crafting bombs. And since it was so well constructed, the police and coroner later on were only able to collect about 16 kilograms of his deceased body. The detonation was so massive that it shifted the bearing walls of the entry hall. It also knocked out all the windows in the nearby dining hall, and the wave could be felt right up to the 5th floor of the building. The total damage of the spa would be calculated to about 20 million Czech crowns, which for a comparison is about 750,000 pounds. The life-size portrait of Vincent Prisnitz that was hanging in the main hall was obviously completely destroyed, but later a local artist was commissioned to recreate it. The sound of the explosion traveled for miles and miles, and all the people in the nearby villages heard it, and so they were very terrified because they didn't know what was happening, and it wasn't until later when the news started to spread. However, by some amazing miracle, nobody except for Bohumil died. About 20 people did get injured, and the majority of them would have been older women with second-degree burns. The receptionist, who was actually a very close friend of my uncle's partner at the time, would end up in a hospital with her hair partially scalped, but ultimately would make a full physical recovery. It is unknown why Bohumil chose to set the bomb off at the spa, even though there are some mentions about his previous trifles with the management, and he was also allegedly setting off fireworks at the property while he was visiting the spa. This is then further supported by various reports given on his account by his former colleagues, who all confirmed that he was just not right in the head, and he had some very strange and dangerous ideas about the use of various explosives. Later, when Bohumil's apartment was being searched, the police uncovered almost 56 kilograms of further explosives. Bohumil also often claimed that he was actually part of the original team that had invented SEMTEX, but that was later denied by the company. Now, where the story gets very personal for me is that at the time of the event, my family was hosting about 60 German tourists. They all would come to us every year because a lot of their family would originally come from the area, and so they wanted to visit the old site. And as a nice outing day idea for when they're not hiking, they wanted to organize an afternoon tea at the spa. However, that day, they all got turned down because the place was fully booked. And so this brings us to the end of our episode. Now, I'm very aware that I crammed it with a lot of history and dates this time, but I still hope that you found it informative and interesting. What I would love to know now is whether you or someone you know also experienced such a close call in their life. And if so, then please let me know in the comments below. Until next time.